Good evening and welcome to Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom and I'm the host of the program this evening. If this is the first time you're joining us, this is our sixth show. We produce a new show every other week here in Iowa City at the Public Access Studios, but at the time you're watching this show, we're on every week at the same time, so we hope you keep joining us. This show is being produced by volunteers to try and bring some vital discussion to a variety of issues faced by our state and local communities. You know, there's a lot of things on TV, but I can guarantee you that the topics and issues that we address you're not going to see on other stations or other programs. So we hope you tell your friends about it and keep tuning in. The other thing about this show is that we also have an internet discussion forum, and we're going to tell you about that a little bit later, how you can sign up for it to participate in discussion of topics that we discuss on the show, give us ideas for shows, and basically give us some feedback on how we're doing. The topic for tonight's show is water quality in Iowa, and as part of that discussion we have two people with us. George Hallberg, the Associate Director of the State Hygienic Laboratory, and L.D. McMullen, the CEO and General Manager of the Des Moines Water Works, and we're pleased to have you both with us this evening to discuss these important issues. Maybe to get things rolling, could you, L.D. and George, L.D. you can start out, tell us a little bit about your job and how long you've been doing it.
Well, I've been at the Des Moines Water Works for 19 years, and I've been the manager of the Des Moines Water Works for the last 11 years. I'm the top dog, so when everybody wants to complain, I'm the last one they get to complain to. It's an exciting job, and I really enjoy it, and I think utility work is extremely exciting.
Very good. George?
Should add for LD, though, he's not only top dog in Des Moines, but he carries a lot of national influence also in terms of affecting federal programs, even in terms of our water resources, and serves all of us, not just Des Moines, really, in that regard. But myself, yes, I'm with the University of Iowa Hygienic Laboratory, and we serve as the state's public health and environmental laboratory. And we provide services to public water supplies like LDs and the Department of Natural Resources, as well as private citizens and industry in terms of analytical support primarily. But we also conduct a variety of water quality monitoring programs. Between my role there and a past life, shall we say, here in the state, I've been working on water resource issues in Iowa for about 25 years.
Very good. And I should have noted, George is also viewed as a national expert on water quality issues and certainly been instrumental in moving our state forward. And of course, many people remember LD for going on full detail back in 1993 to bring the Des Moines Water Works plant back online after the flood. And LD's a bit of a folk hero in the Des Moines area, I'm told, if not in our state.
Hopefully it's starting to die away.
LD, what is the largest challenge facing you as a water plant operator in our state?
Well, I think our number one issue, and this is what we hear from our customers, we do a customer survey of everybody that we come in contact with. And the number one thing that comes up on that every time is water quality. People are more tuned to that now than they have been in the past. They're wanting to know what it is that they're consuming. They want to be able to be told of issues prior to them becoming a major problem for them. We've tried to be very proactive in that particular area, both from an informational source as well as trying to play detective and going after things that aren't necessarily regulated, so that we can provide an appropriate education program for our consumers, as well as protecting their public health. You know, so many people around the world would wish to have the quality of water that we have in the United States. We go to the faucet, we fill up a glass of water, and we may think a little bit, but we drink it, and most of the time there isn't a problem. But in a lot of other places in the world, you just don't do that. So water quality, both from a detective and from an education standpoint, is our number one issue.
George, can you give us some sense about, in terms of, we've got surface water supplies and groundwater supplies, approximately how is the state divided up in terms of how many people are, do you have a sense about that?
Oh my, the figures I probably should have looked up.
That's all right.
We have, yeah, as you're right, we have quite a mix. And on the public water supply side, the number of public water supplies are dominated by groundwater, but some of our largest public water supplies use surface water or very shallow groundwater, mixed surface water supplies. And so probably the largest, I think it's about 50-50 population-wise when you look at who is served. We still have, even though our population has become dominantly urban, we still have about, a third of our Iowa citizens are on their own water supplies in the countryside too, and that's almost exclusively groundwater in terms of private wells, and these all present different kinds of challenges in terms of water quality.
So we have cities like Des Moines on surface water, and Iowa City in Davenport, I assume, is on surface water. How about Sioux City?
Sioux City is a groundwater.
Are they? Cedar Rapids is groundwater.
Right.
And,
but again, mainly an alluvial well field, so we at times they're
connected.
We don't draw quite as firm a line between them.
What are some of the most important water qualities facing our state right now, LD?
Well, I think from the drinking water side, probably the thing that is the biggest concern, at least to us, is microbial. There's a lot of things that have been publicized about nitrates and pesticides and those type of things, and those are of a concern. But microbial, I think, is the issue that is kind of the sleeping giant out there that we need to be paying a lot more attention to. I think that's not only true in Iowa, I think it is also true nationally. And I heard a statistic the other day of all the microorganisms that exist, we have identified 5% of them. And so there's a lot of critters out there that we need to be kind of concerned about. And as the state moves more to larger confinement feeding operations, I think we need to be concerned about the animal population and how that may impact us also in the microbial area. George, I know, is very concerned about the microbial things.
What are the source of the microbials? Livestock in general, or are there other sources?
We're the source of many of the ones that affect humans, and it's the things the types of pathogens and that have the biggest potential health effects are from human waste, but animals do carry some of the things that are being talked about in the press more and more, Cryptosporidium, Giardia, things of this nature. Animals, they aren't as selective, and most any warm-blooded animal carries some of these, and so waste, both human and animal waste, are part of the concern. And maybe just to amplify what LD says, there are a myriad of contaminants in our drinking water supplies that are of concern. Chemicals make the news quite often, but I think the reason we put microbial concerns at the top of the list is because they are such an immediate kind of health impact. When you have a microbial problem, there's not much question about the long-term health effects. It's immediate. And some of them are very subtle, and we don't really even understand them or track them. A lot of waterborne illnesses give you some flu-like symptoms that we don't track and we don't understand, and we know they're underestimated and underreported. And so these are things that are very immediate kinds of health concerns that you always have to stay on top of.
So Cryptosporidium was one that was noted. How big an issue is that for Iowans right now? How concerned should we be about that?
Well, we find Cryptosporidium and Giardia in our rivers. Not all the time, but periodically we find them. So they're in the natural waters. I think that Iowa, because of its high, I think it's around 80% of the water supplies are on groundwater in the state of Iowa. But because of that, probably it's less of a concern to the state than a state that might have 80% on surface waters. But it's treatable, and that's the important part that we have to remember. But you got to do it right, and you got to stay on top of issues in the treatment scheme. And of course, the most famous one is the situation in Milwaukee, where it was a combination of a very heavy runoff event and operator error. And you can't rely upon just one barrier. That's really the strategy for crypto and giardia is that you have to have multiple barriers. So if one of them doesn't work for you, you got another one behind it that will catch it. And that's been our strategy at the Des Moines Water Works.
Very good, very good. I know there's people having some concern about that. In terms of the agricultural issue, in terms of large hog lagoons and in containment of those wastes, do water plants plan for contingencies around, say, a lagoon that would break in a given watershed? Do you plan for that kind of thing, or is that something that it's hard to deal with?
Well, it's really interesting that you raise that question, because that is really the focus that EPA is working on right at the current time, and really what I think was the focus of the reauthorization of the Safe Drinking Water Act. The EPA really believes that we need to be working on watersheds, and we need to be understanding exactly what potential contaminants might be in our watershed and plan for those. The water industry historically have operated at, well, whatever comes down, we'll treat it. And we'll treat it to a point where people aren't going to become sick. Water utilities now are saying, because of wanting to do the multiple barrier idea, is, well, maybe we should prevent some of these things up in the watershed, and that will be a barrier that is probably the best barrier, rather than trying to treat it once it gets into the streams. So watershed management, watershed protection is the big word right at the current time, and hog confinements or cattle feedlots or fertilizer chemical storage tanks are all things that are potential sources in our watershed, and we need to be planning for those type of situations.
I see. George, what would be some specific strategies to encourage watershed protection or watershed management?
Well, one of the keys is really citizen involvement. You know, when we talk about the sources of water pollution, you know, as we started to touch on, the easy way to sum that up is to look around. It's all of us, and it's the actions that we do on the land. And the watershed approach and the source water protection approach that is now coming about, I think, is part of the changing philosophy in environmental protection we've seen in the past decade, and that is we're finding it's much more efficient, cheaper, and better in the long run to try and prevent pollution in the first place. And so we need to get more involvement, you know, both in our individual lives as well as business and industry at preventing pollution in the first place. You know, reducing the sources of pollutants that we all put into the environment, not only for water supplies, but even just the what should we say, the ecological health of our streams and rivers in particular. One of the major problems that we face is what we call non-point source pollution. And it's, we've done a lot in the past 20 years to clean up the pollutants that industry and cities have put into rivers and streams. But the biggest portion of the remaining kinds of problems we see with our water supplies are related to the broad kinds of things that we all do. And that you can talk about farm management in terms of nutrients. LD mentioned nitrate. It's the most important of plant nutrients, but we've got to manage it on the land if we're going to prevent it getting into the water. You mentioned manure and runoff from livestock waste. All of those issues. Pesticides are land applied, and there's no place you can point to typically, unless it's a spill or an industrial accident, that says here's our source. The source is across our land management, be it our lawns in the urban setting, farms, golf courses, what have you. And so we really need to be more diligent across the board in terms of our management to really prevent pollution in the first place.
How do the costs of watershed management compare to the costs of treatment technologies? I know a number of years ago Des Moines spent some money to remove nitrate from the water. Are you guys involved right now in spending money in the watershed as well? Are there programs going on in your area?
Well, we're really looking into that, and we are part of what is called the Raccoon River Watershed Project, and that particular one is a demonstration project to look at different kinds of ways that we can handle nutrients as well as pesticides to come up with a better overall water quality in the Raccoon River. But I think regardless of however we approach it, we have to look upon watershed protection as a partnering. And whether we like it or not, agriculture is a very important part of this state's economy, and we need to be able to work in partnership with agriculture. And I think there are ways of doing that. The Ag Department has just tightened up the conservation reserve requirements so that it is the land that is to be put into that is the environmentally sensitive land. Secretary Glickman has indicated that he's willing to go even a little bit farther in that area. He's announced his filter strip initiative of, I think it's 1 million miles of filter strip or something like that. And so what I see is happening is not only in EPA, but I think other federal programs are also kind of grasping this watershed idea and to put everything together in kind of a nice package and all working for the same end result with all the programs that we have. And so you got conservation reserve, you've got water pollution monies, you've got drinking water monies, and I think it's all sitting around the table. All the affected interests is what George was talking about earlier with the citizen participation of putting together a package that makes good sense.
That's good. That's good. In terms of the nitrates, I know you remove them. What is the final destination of those nitrates? Do they go back in the river? Do they go?
That always seems to be something people bring up, and we recycle them back to the river downstream from our treatment plant. People think that once we get them out that we should keep them out. We did look at that. It would become extremely expensive for us to try to do that. My wish and goal in life is to never have to run the nitrate removal facility ever again.
I see, sure.
And I would love to be able to just dust off the tanks and not have to use them.
That's good. George, how do we pay for watershed management, watershed protection? Is that something we're going to see in our utility bills?
Well, I think
for water,
we may to an extent see that in our utility bills, but and the question you mentioned about the trade-offs of cost between water treatment and watershed protection is one in other parts of the country where we have much bigger, frankly, municipalities, that there is some more direct trading going on, if you will, and we don't have quite that luxury. But Joe, frankly, there's a lot of win-win situations in this for everybody that will, cut or at least, help to hold down the costs in terms of public water supply treatment. But as LD was mentioning, there's a lot of influx of resources coming into, say, the agricultural sector to help farmers. But on that front, there's a lot of win-win situations, and I just recap maybe a couple of things. We're also celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Groundwater Protection Act. And under that, we started some pilot programs, if you will, an operation that we call the Integrated Farm Management Demonstration Program, which was statewide. Through that, trying to help work with farmers to educate them on better technology, even a decade ago. We've reduced, since 1985, we've reduced the loading of nitrogen fertilizer in the state by over 20%, in contrast to what other states that haven't done that. This is reduced by a couple of billion pounds, really, the amount of nitrogen we're using to produce crops. And yet we've, just in the past 5 years, we've set two all-time record crop yields. So we've reduced input costs, we've reduced loading into the environment, and we haven't impacted our yields. And so that's money in the bank for our producers. And there's still a lot more that can be done in that regard, that through better management, and that's part of the problem. It's a tricky thing, but it takes better management. But where farmers and even homeowners can save money and still produce the crops they need, have the green lawn, etc. But we can reduce some of that pollutant that comes in and winds up down at the water plant and then costs us money once again to take out. So in that sense, there's the economics of it. There's a lot that can be done if we can get the incentives and the education and the technology transferred out there to do it.
Well, that's really an excellent example of one of the major success stories of the Groundwater Protection Act, and maybe need to continue to work in that area. LD, do we?
Well,
go
just
ahead.
as a follow-up to
Sure.
George's comment there where he talks about education, I think it's extremely important. This last spring I took the opportunity to go up and sit in a couple of grain elevators up in our watershed, visiting with farmers about what it was that we were trying to do. I was very well received by those farmers. They were very interested in the impacts that they were having. And I sat right next to this one farmer. I was filling out a form that we asked him to fill out at the end of the presentation. One of the questions was, how big of an impact do you think you have on Des Moines water quality? He circled 75%. And he said, I saw you looking at me. And I said, yeah. I was curious as to which one you were going to circle. And he said, well, I circled 75%. And I said, prior to today, what have you circled? And he said, I really thought we had minimal impact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think what George has indicated is education is an extremely important part of it. And then incentives and partnerships and all this other stuff builds on it once we become educated on the issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, we all live in the watershed. It's not just everybody upstream of us, and a lot of agricultural land, and certainly farmers over the last number of years have taken their share of hard knocks on this issue, but urban dwellers live in the watershed too, and we, as George pointed out, there's a number of areas that we have impacts on. You're watching Iowa News and Views. We're talking water quality this evening. We've got a couple state experts with us. I'd like to thank those of you who have sent in questions for tonight's show. We're going to give you some information a little bit on how you can send questions for our guests on our next show, when we're going to be talking about alternative energy and wind power. George, do we need a groundwater or a surface water protection act in this state?
Well, good question. You know, we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Groundwater Protection Act. But in reality, well, that was in the title. It was a very comprehensive kind of bill, and most of the things that it set into place are also protective of surface water. But you know, some people feel that we haven't maybe made enough progress or paid enough attention to surface water. I guess I would come back to one other point, is that I think in October we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, the Federal Clean Water Act, whose focus really was surface water. And I don't know if we need a surface water act per se. We certainly can use some re-energizing, if you will, of the spirit of, you know, our water quality protection programs. You know, I think our emphasis on these things wax and wanes over time, and this is a good time with all these anniversaries to reflect on that. You know, we have a Clean Water Act that addresses that, but we could certainly use some renewed emphasis, I guess. I think we've lost some inertia in Iowa, you know, over the past 5 years or so in dealing with water quality issues.
1997 is the year of water in Iowa. LD, what's going on with that? Are there going to be local activities around the state for people to get involved in?
I think there really will be. One of the ones that we're extremely excited about in Des Moines is that we're going to have the very first Children's Water Festival coming up here in about a month. And we're going to have 1,500 fifth graders coming from all over the state of Iowa to come and study water at the Des Moines Area Community College. I think those type of things of dealing with our young people of the state to recognize the importance of water is the start of really being able to carry this whole year of water to become the year of the next decade or the year of the next millennium.
So begin to fire up Iowans again about our role in making for clean water.
Absolutely.
That's very good. Safe Drinking Water Act that is being discussed these days, and disinfection standards in particular. What changes do we see coming up, LD, in this area?
Well, I think this is one of them that's going to be extremely interesting to watch. As we talked about just a little while ago here, the microbial concerns on drinking water, we also have the other side of the coin, that if you end up putting in too much disinfectant, and if you have a bunch of organics, you end up forming compounds that are called trihalomethanes that are a concern for public health. So now you got this concern on this one side with trihalomethanes, and you got this concern over here on the other side for the microbial. You don't want to drop too much on the disinfection to raise the microbial, and so it's a balancing act.
I see.
And there is a federal committee right now trying to come up with this balance, to come up with what is right for the drinking water systems for the state, or for the nation as that goes. The disinfection byproduct rule that's coming up is going to be probably the most complex rule, and it's going to be all made off of judgment rather than off of real data.
George, do you have a final comment on that point, on disinfection and how it affects you?
Well, I think that whole issue, Joe, is kind of the characterized as part of the dilemma of modern day. You know, we don't have people dying from typhoid and cholera and things like that anymore because of the public health efforts to disinfect public water supplies. And it's really been the past 20 years that we found out that disinfection byproducts are a very real, you know, cancer concern if not controlled properly. And so now we're trying to figure out how do we balance that, because as we talked earlier, the microbial threats are very real and very immediate versus these long-term health effects of things like disinfection byproducts or other types of organic chemicals we may find in our water supplies. And so it's a struggle, and as you've pointed out, it's got to involve all of us because we're all part of the problem.
Very good. Well, we're getting down to the end of our half hour. Boy, it went pretty fast. I'd like to thank our guests, George Hallberg, Associate Director of the State Hygienic Laboratory, and L.D. McMullen, the CEO and General Manager of the Des Moines Water Works. It's a pleasure to have you both here. We'd also like to thank you for viewing and tuning us in. We'll be back at the same time next week with another show. In a moment, we're going to be giving you some information about how to get a hold of us. We'd like to hear from you. We're going to be talking about alternative energy next time with members of some folks that are working on that in the state to develop 2 very large wind energy projects to take us and make us a little bit more sustainable where our energy is concerned. I would like to thank you for tuning in and pay attention in a moment. We'll give you some information on how to get in touch with us. You've been watching Iowa News and Views. My name's Joe Balcom. We'll see you next time.